All right, so in this video, we're going to do an introduction to fascism and look at the rise of fascism in Italy. So let's do a little bit of context. So let's put fascism into context. So after World War I, a lot of the social and economic and political ideas of the 19th century were called into question because for a lot of people, they viewed these things as causes of World War I. So if we take, for instance, something like science, science gave us the Industrial Revolution, but science also gave us the machine gun and poison gas. If we think about listening to the people and allowing the people a say in how government works, this is what gave us nationalism. And even something like democracy seemed to make World War I worse as Great Britain and France expanded the scope of the war. So the things that we've been building in the 19th century, positivism, science and technology, the Industrial Revolution, liberalism, liberal democracy, all of these things were seen with a little bit of suspicion because you can make a very good case that those are the very things that led to World War I. And as we move through the Great Depression, democracies were seen as failing, while Stalinism was thriving. The Soviet Union was growing during the Great Depression. So again, we have another piece of evidence that says maybe democracy isn't the right course. Maybe we need to go back towards some kind of totalitarian government. And so there were very prevalent movements in, so there were totalitarian movements in places you might not expect them. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in France. So we've talked about one totalitarian state, and that was the Soviet Union. But let's see how countries that weren't already kind of dictatorial adopted totalitarian governments. So this is where we bring in fascism. So before we start talking about fascism in Italy, let's define the term. So fascism is a relatively new political ideology. So it's less than 100 years old. And because it's relatively new and it wasn't actually in practice for very long, we don't have as clear a definition of what fascism is, but there are some common characteristics of fascist governments. So maybe the first idea is that it is ultra-nationalist. So it attempts to unify a nation against a real or maybe just a perceived threat. So some of the threats that the Italians and the Germans are going to unite against are real. So if we look at maybe their treatment in the Treaty of Versailles, those were real threats. But some of these threats are made up. They just perceive them as a threat, like an international Jewish conspiracy. That's not real. They just perceive it as real. Fascists also typically oppose democracy, and they prefer a single leader with unchecked power. Maybe this is like a 20th century version of an absolute monarch. Maybe that might be one way to think about this. They also oppose socialism. Here's why they oppose socialism. Socialists reject the idea of nations. Because for a socialist, only economic class matters. So for a socialist, it doesn't matter if you are a German worker, an American worker, a Russian worker, a British worker. It doesn't matter as long as you're a worker. Workers across the world, it doesn't matter what your nationality is, you are a worker. Fascists don't view economic class. Fascists reject economic class, and they only look at nationality. So it doesn't matter if you're a rich German or a poor German or a middle-class German. What matters is that you are German. And so because of this, fascists and socialists are diametrically opposed. They are natural enemies. Fascists aren't opposed to violence. In fact, they see violence as a good thing. It makes you stronger. Now, there's a couple of ways you could interpret this. There is kind of this like survival of the fittest approach. That the strongest nations will win out. And you can definitely see this idea in fascist propaganda. But on a practical level, they also use violence against political enemies. And they'll often use unofficial military groups to attack rival politicians or social groups they don't like. Economically, fascists make close connections to private business and often bring them in to the government. This is a process called corporatism. Where the government basically co-opts and brings in business to the government. So the businesses are kind of part of the government. They make decisions with the government. And then finally, the last characteristic of fascism that we might bring up is that there is usually a mythologized history of the nation. Which dates back to usually a far gone period in history. And the fascists want to regain that greatness. For the Italians, this of course goes back to the Roman Empire. For the Germans, this goes back to the Holy Roman Empire. And Charlemagne. So when Hitler creates the Third Reich, the First Reich, so Reich is the German word for empire, the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich was the one that was defeated in World War I and subsequently fell apart after the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's Reich was the Third Reich. And kind of going along with this, there is this sense of perceived grievance against those preventing the greatness from returning. For the Italians, this was kind of focused against the Allies. And maybe the new countries that were created that should have been Italian, like Yugoslavia. For the Germans, it's the Allies to a degree because they wrote the Treaty of Versailles, but it's also the Jews, and it's probably also the communists. All of those groups will have significant anger pointed towards them by the Germans. One last thing we'll mention about this mythologized history is that fascists love the media. Fascists love the media, especially new media. And they use it to spread their ideas. So there are very groundbreaking Nazi propaganda films. They are technically brilliant, but they are using, or they're spouting Nazi propaganda, but they're doing it in very technically interesting ways in terms of filmmaking. All right, so that's a basic list of characteristics of what fascism is. So let's take a quick look at an example of this. So we're going to start with Italy. And the story of fascism in Italy begins and ends with Benito Mussolini. So Mussolini was born in 1883. His mother was a teacher, and his father was kind of a socialist, I guess, maybe politician, writer. What matters is that his father was a socialist. Mussolini was himself very bright. Mussolini was trained as a teacher. He was actually trained as a kindergarten teacher. I think that's one of the funniest things in history is I can only imagine what Mussolini would have been like as a kindergarten teacher. But he never actually taught, and he started working as a writer for socialist newspapers in the early 1900s. So he spent most of his young life as a journalist. He wrote for socialist newspapers. Most Italian socialists opposed World War I, mostly because working people were killing each other. But Mussolini supported the war because it would unite Italians in Italy with Italians in Austria-Hungary. So he was hoping that the Italians would unify, that there were still Italians who lived in areas controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he saw World War I as a way to unite them. For supporting the war, he was kicked out of the Socialist Party. It's around this time that he kind of names his new ideology. And he names it Fascism, after the word in Italian fascio, which is literally a bundle of sticks. And the idea is that it's unity through strength, or strength through unity. That a single stick is easily broken, but a bundle of sticks is hard to break. He volunteers for the war. And is injured. He's wounded in the war. And he spends the rest of the war writing pro-war propaganda for the British. For publication in Italy. Now, after the war, Mussolini is angry that the Paris Peace Conference didn't result in Italy gaining more territory. So he believed that Italy needed to have areas of the Mediterranean that were kind of mythologically connected to the Roman Empire. So stuff on the other side of the Adriatic Sea, so on the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea. So places like Yugoslavia or Albania. He also starts promoting the idea that Italians are better than Slavs and Africans, by the way, and they deserve to take this territory. So they deserve to have the lands controlled by the Slavs, and they deserve African colonies. And so this is going to lead directly to Italy colonizing Libya in North Africa and having a second go at taking over Ethiopia, which they do successfully take over in 1936. I'm sorry, 1935. Now, the big break for Mussolini happens in 1922. So in 1922, Mussolini published a story in one of his newspapers that said he and the military wing, the military group of his fascist party, was going to march on Rome and demand that the King of Italy make Mussolini the prime minister. And they did. This actually happened. So this happened on October the 22nd, 1922. And it wasn't as big a rally as everyone thought it would be, but it wasn't insignificant either. So about 30,000 black shirts, that was the name of the paramilitary group, and the king caved. And named Mussolini prime minister. And over the next 10 years, Mussolini banned other parties and most means of political participation. But we'll pick up the story of Mussolini in Italy as we move into World War II. So we'll pick this thread up as we move into World War II. So in our next video, we'll cover this same idea, but we'll do it in Germany. So we'll look at how Hitler comes to power in Germany and how he was able to kind of legally take power and then illegally eliminate all of his rivals. So we'll do that in our next video, but until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.